The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, as Josephine Nichols pressed her back against the weathered barn door, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. The year was 1878, and she had just witnessed something no woman should ever have to see: the cold-blooded murder of a man who had only been trying to help her. Josephine's chest heaved as she fought to catch her breath, the weight of her sodden skirts pulling at her limbs as rain began to fall in earnest. She had fled Hollow Creek 3 days prior with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's silver locket tucked safely against her skin. At 23, she had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age, but nothing had prepared her for the brutality of the West. "He can't have gone far," a gruff voice called out from beyond the barn. "Find the girl and kill her. She's seen too much." Josephine's blood ran cold. The Blackburn Gang, notorious outlaws who had been terrorizing the Colorado Territory for months, were searching for her. Their leader, Theodore Blackburn, had murdered the stagecoach driver in cold blood when he refused to surrender the lockbox containing the mining payroll. Josephine had been the only passenger, and now she was the only witness. The sound of approaching footsteps sent her scrambling deeper into the shadows of the barn. Her hands trembled as she gathered her skirts, trying to silence the rustling fabric. She needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere these men wouldn't think to look. "Check the barn, Roy." The voice was closer now. Tears burned behind Josephine's eyes as she frantically searched for an escape. The hayloft was too exposed, the stalls too obvious. Her gaze fell upon a large trunk pushed against the back wall of the barn. Without hesitation, she lifted the heavy lid and climbed inside, lowering it gently over her head as the barn door creaked open. Through a small crack where the lid didn't quite meet the base, Josephine watched as a pair of mud-caked boots stepped into view. The outlaw moved methodically through the barn, checking each stall and corner with his revolver drawn. Josephine held her breath, pressing a hand over her mouth to stifle any sound. "Nothing in here," the man finally called out before leaving, the barn door swinging shut behind him. Only when the footsteps had faded completely did Josephine allow herself to breathe again. She waited several more minutes before cautiously pushing open the trunk lid and climbing out, her muscles stiff from being cramped in such a small space. Night had fallen, and with it came a bone-chilling cold that penetrated her already damp clothing. Josephine knew she couldn't stay in the barn. Once the outlaws realized she wasn't in the immediate vicinity, they would return to search more thoroughly. She peered out through a gap in the wooden slats. The rain had intensified, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. In the distance, she could make out the flickering lights of a town Cedar Ridge, if the stagecoach driver had been correct before his untimely death. It wasn't much, but it was her only hope. Taking a deep breath, Josephine slipped out of the barn and into the storm, keeping low as she made her way through the tall grass toward the distant lights. The mud sucked at her boots, threatening to pull them from her feet with each step. The wind lashed at her face, carrying raindrops that felt like tiny needles against her skin. By the time she reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Josephine was soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. Her honey-blonde hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wet ropes down her back. The town was quiet, most of its inhabitants having sought shelter from the storm. A sign swinging in the wind caught her attention. The Silver Dollar Saloon and Hotel. The building was 2 stories tall, with warm light spilling from its windows onto the muddy street. Josephine hesitated, knowing that a saloon was hardly a respectable place for a young woman alone, but she had no other options. Gathering what remained of her courage, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The sudden warmth enveloped her, as did the smell of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. The chatter died down as all eyes turned to her, a bedraggled, soaking wet woman standing in the doorway. "Well, look what the storm dragged in," one man called out, eliciting laughter from several others. Josephine lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated despite her appearance. She scanned the room, noting the card games in progress and the saloon girls draped over the laps of their customers. At the far end of the room, a tall man stood behind the bar, watching her with interest. She made her way toward him, ignoring the whispers and stares. "I need a room," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just for tonight." The bartender looked her up and down, taking in her expensive, if ruined, traveling dress and the quality of her boots. "That'll be $2, miss." Josephine's heart sank. In her hurry to escape, she had left her reticule in the stagecoach. I don't have any money," she admitted, "but I can work. I can clean, or serve drinks." The bartender's expression hardened. "This ain't a charity, lady. No money, no room." "She can stay in my room," a deep voice interjected. Josephine turned to find herself face to face with a man she hadn't noticed before. He was tall, with broad shoulders and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. His dark blonde hair was damp from the rain, and he wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, worn denim trousers, a simple shirt with a leather vest, and a hat that he'd removed upon entering the establishment. "I don't think," Josephine began, but the man cut her off. "Not like that," he said, his voice low. "You can have the bed. I'll take the floor." Suspicion colored her features. "Why would you help me?" The corner of his mouth lifted in a slight smile. "Because you look like you could use it, madam." Before Josephine could respond, the saloon doors burst open again, and 3 men entered, shaking the rain from their coats. Her blood froze in her veins as she recognized them members of the Blackburn Gang. Without thinking, she turned away, pulling her hair forward to hide her face. The cowboy noticed her reaction immediately. "Follow me," he murmured, placing a hand lightly on her elbow and guiding her toward the stairs at the back of the room. Josephine didn't resist, too terrified of being discovered. They ascended the stairs quickly, the cowboy leading her to a door at the end of the hallway. Once inside, he locked the door behind them and turned to face her. "You're in trouble," he stated. Not a question, but a fact. Josephine nodded, her teeth chattering from cold and fear. "Those men, they're looking for me." The cowboy moved to the small wood stove in the corner of the room and added a few pieces of kindling. "Why?" "I witnessed them murder a man," she said, watching as he coaxed the fire to life. "The stagecoach driver. They robbed us, and when he tried to protect the payroll, they shot him." The cowboy straightened, his expression grim. "The Blackburn Gang. You know of them?" "Everyone does." He removed his vest and draped it over the back of a chair. "My name's Hank. Hank Sutton." "Josephine Nichols," she replied, then immediately regretted giving her real name. If these men were asking questions around town, she had just put herself in danger. As if reading her mind, Hank said, "Don't worry. I won't tell anyone you're here." "Why are you helping me?" Josephine asked again, genuinely puzzled by his kindness. Hank's expression softened. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be hunted." Before she could question him further, he retrieved a clean shirt from a trunk and handed it to her. "You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. I'll turn around." Josephine hesitated, but the prospect of dry clothing was too tempting to resist. "Thank you." Hank turned to face the wall while she quickly changed, struggling with the buttons of her dress with numb fingers. The shirt he had given her was far too large, reaching almost to her knees, but it was warm and dry. "I'm decent," she said after a moment. When Hank turned back, his eyes widened slightly at the sight of her in his shirt, her wet clothing draped over the chair to dry. He quickly averted his gaze. "You should take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor." Josephine shook her head. "I can't take your bed." "You're not taking it." "I'm offering it," Hank insisted. "Besides, I've slept on worse than a wooden floor." Too exhausted to argue, Josephine climbed onto the narrow bed, pulling the rough woolen blanket up to her chin. The events of the day caught up with her all at once, and she found herself fighting back tears. "They'll kill me if they find me," she whispered. Hank sat on the edge of the bed, his expression serious. "I won't let that happen. You don't even know me." "I know enough." He stood and moved to the window, peering out at the rain-soaked street below. "Get some sleep, Miss Nichols. We'll figure things out in the morning." Despite her fear and the unfamiliar surroundings, Josephine fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, comforted by the presence of the mysterious cowboy who had offered her shelter from both the storm and her pursuers. When she awoke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the small window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment, Josephine was disoriented, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back: the stagecoach robbery, the murder, her desperate flight through the rain. She sat up quickly, looking around the room. Hank was already awake, seated at a small table near the window, cleaning a revolver with practiced hands. He looked up at her movement. "Mornin'," he said. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Josephine admitted, pushing her tangled hair away from her face. Her clothes, she noticed, were still damp, though not as soaked as they had been the night before. Hank nodded toward a tray on the bedside table. "I brought you some breakfast. Figured you might be hungry." The simple meal of bread, cheese, and coffee looked like a feast to Josephine, who hadn't eaten since the day before. "Thank you," she said, reaching for the cup of steaming coffee. As she ate, Hank continued to work on his weapon, occasionally glancing out the window at the street below. "Your friends from last night are still in town," he informed her. "I saw them heading into the sheriff's office earlier." Josephine nearly choked on her bread. "The sheriff? Are they working with the law?" "Doubt it," Hank replied, sliding the clean revolver into his holster. "More likely they're spinning some tale about looking for a thief or a runaway wife. Anything to get the law on their side without revealing their true intentions." "What am I going to do?" Josephine asked, setting down her half-eaten breakfast. "I can't stay in this room forever, but I can't leave town with them watching every road." Hank was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Where were you headed before all this happened?" "San Francisco," she replied. "My aunt lives there. She's the only family I have left since my parents passed." "That's a long way from Colorado." "Yes, but I had to leave Hollow Creek." Josephine looked down at her hands, remembering the life she had fled. "There was nothing for me there anymore." Hank seemed to sense there was more to her story, but he didn't press. Instead, he said, "I know these parts well. There are trails the Blackburn Gang wouldn't know about. I could get you safely to the next town, where you could catch a train west." Josephine's eyes widened. "You would do that for me? Why?" Hank's expression remained unreadable. "Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see Theodore Blackburn and his gang brought to justice." Before Josephine could question him further, there was a knock at the door. She froze, fear clutching at her heart. Hank motioned for her to be silent and moved quietly to the door. "Who is it?" he called out. "It's me, Hank." "Emma," a female voice replied. Hank's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he opened the door to reveal a young woman with auburn hair, dressed in the practical attire of a saloon girl. Her eyes widened when she saw Josephine sitting on the bed wearing Hank's shirt. "Well, well," Emma said, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "I see why you weren't interested in my company last night." "It's not what you think," Hank replied, stepping aside to let her enter. Emma looked between them skeptically. In any case, I thought you should know that those men who came in last night are asking questions about a young blonde woman, offering a reward for information." Josephine's stomach dropped. Emma turned to her, her expression softening. "Don't worry, honey. I didn't tell them anything. Neither did the others. We may be saloon girls, but we know better than to trust men like that. Thank you, Josephine said sincerely. Emma moved to the dresser and removed a bundle of clothing from a bag she carried. I brought you some things to wear. They're not fancy, but they're dry, and they might help you blend in a little better. Josephine examined the simple cotton dress and shawl. This is very kind of you. Just returning a favor, Emma replied, glancing at Hank. Your friend here helped me out of a tight spot once. Besides, us women have to stick together in these parts. After Emma left, Josephine changed into the borrowed clothes, grateful for their simplicity. The dress was a little loose but fit well enough, and the shawl would help conceal her face if necessary. We need to get you out of town, Hank said once she was dressed, but we'll have to be careful. Those men will be watching the main road. How do we leave without being seen? Josephine asked. Hank's mouth curved into a small smile. There's more than one way out of Cedar Ridge. They waited until dusk, when the lengthening shadows would provide additional cover. Hank had spent the day making preparations, leaving Josephine alone in the room for hours at a time. When he finally returned, he carried a small pack containing provisions and a second revolver, which he handed to her. Do you know how to use this? He asked. Josephine took the weapon, feeling its weight in her palm. My father taught me, though I've never had to use one against a person. Let's hope you don't have to, Hank replied, but it's better to have it and not need it than the other way around. As night fell, they made their way quietly down the back stairs of the saloon and into the alley behind. Hank had arranged for 2 horses to be waiting for them there, a sturdy brown gelding for himself, and a dapple gray mare for Josephine. We'll ride north out of town, he explained as he helped her mount. There's an old mining trail that cuts through the hills. The Blackburn Gang won't know about it. It's not on any maps. Josephine gathered the reins in her hands, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. What if they follow us? Hank's expression hardened. Then they'll regret it. They rode out of Cedar Ridge under the cover of darkness, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main streets. Josephine's heart pounded in her chest, expecting at any moment to hear shouts of discovery or the sound of pursuing hoofbeats. But they reached the edge of town without incident, and soon the buildings gave way to open country. Once clear of the town, they urged their horses to a faster pace, following a barely visible trail that wound its way toward the foothills. The night was clear, with a half-moon providing just enough light to see by. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, carrying the scent of sage and pine. They rode in silence for several hours, Hank occasionally checking their back trail to ensure they weren't being followed. Josephine's muscles ached from the unaccustomed activity, but she didn't complain. Every mile they put between themselves and Cedar Ridge was a mile closer to safety. Finally, when the moon had traversed a significant portion of the sky, Hank led them into a sheltered canyon where a small stream trickled over smooth rocks. We'll rest here for a few hours, he said, dismounting and helping Josephine down from her horse. The horses need water, and we could both use some sleep. Josephine sank gratefully onto a fallen log while Hank tended to the animals. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was still racing, replaying the events that had led her to this moment, a fugitive in the wilderness with a man she barely knew. You're awfully quiet, Hank observed as he joined her, offering a strip of jerky from his provisions. Josephine accepted the food, chewing thoughtfully before responding. I was just thinking about how quickly one's life can change. 2 days ago, I was on a stagecoach, excited to start a new life in San Francisco. Now I'm running for my life. Hank's expression was sympathetic. Life out here has a way of changing direction when you least expect it. What about you? Josephine asked. You said you know what it's like to be hunted. What did you mean by that? Hank was silent for a long moment, staring into the darkness. Just when Josephine thought he wasn't going to answer, he said, I used to ride with the Blackburn Gang. Josephine stiffened, her hand instinctively moving toward the revolver at her side. Hank noticed and gave a rueful smile. "I don't blame you for being wary," he said. "But I left that life behind 3 years ago. Theodore Blackburn doesn't take kindly to deserters. He's been trying to track me down ever since." "Why did you leave?" Josephine asked, her curiosity overcoming her caution. Hank's expression darkened. "There are lines I won't cross. Blackburn wanted to rob a church during Sunday service. Said it would be easy pickings with everyone in one place. I refused. We fought, and I left that night. Been moving around ever since, never staying in one place too long." "Is that why you're helping me?" Josephine asked. "Because we have the same enemy?" "Partly," Hank admitted. "But mostly because it was the right thing to do. You didn't ask for any of this to happen to you." They fell into silence again, the only sounds the gentle gurgling of the stream and the occasional snort from the horses. Josephine felt her eyelids growing heavy, the events of the past 2 days finally catching up with her. "Get some sleep," Hank said softly. "I'll keep watch." Josephine wanted to protest, to insist that he needed rest too, but exhaustion won out. She wrapped herself in the blanket he offered and lay down on a relatively flat piece of ground near the log. Despite the hard earth beneath her and the unfamiliar surroundings, she fell asleep almost immediately. She dreamed of the stagecoach, of the driver's face as the bullet struck him, of Theodore Blackburn's cold eyes as he ordered his men to find her. In her dream, she was running through an endless forest, the sound of pursuit growing ever closer, until a hand grabbed her shoulder and Josephine woke with a gasp, her heart racing. Dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky with pale pink and gold. Hank was crouched beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression concerned. "You are having a nightmare," he said. Josephine sat up, pushing her hair away from her face. "I was back there, at the stagecoach." Hank nodded in understanding. "Those kinds of memories don't fade quickly, but they do fade, eventually." "Do they?" Josephine asked, remembering the haunted look in his eyes when he spoke of his past. Hank didn't answer. Instead, he stood and offered her his hand. "We should get moving. There's a long day's ride ahead of us." They ate a quick breakfast of jerky and hardtack, washed down with water from the stream, before saddling the horses and continuing their journey. The trail grew steeper as they entered the foothills, winding through stands of pine and aspen. Josephine marveled at the beauty of the landscape, so different from the rolling farmland of her native Missouri. "Where exactly are we headed?" she asked, as they paused to let the horses rest after a particularly steep climb. "There's a town called Silverdale about 40 miles northeast of here," Hank replied, checking his saddle girth. "It's on the Denver and Rio Grande line. You can catch a train there that will take you west." "And what about you?" Josephine found herself strangely reluctant to think about parting ways with this enigmatic cowboy who had risked so much to help her. Hank shrugged. "I'll move on. Find somewhere new to lay low for a while." "That sounds like a lonely life," Josephine observed. "It is," Hank admitted, "but it's better than the alternative." They continued riding, the day growing warmer as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Hank pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area, revealing a deep knowledge of the land and its history. Josephine found herself increasingly drawn to this complex man, whose gruff exterior concealed a thoughtful, honorable nature. Around midday, they stopped in a meadow dotted with wildflowers to rest and water the horses. Josephine stretched her legs, wincing at the soreness in her muscles from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. "You're doing well for someone who hasn't ridden much," Hank commented, noticing her discomfort. Josephine smiled ruefully. "Is it that obvious?" "A little," he replied with a smile that transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look years younger. "But you're a natural. Most city folks would be complaining by now." I'm not from the city, Josephine corrected him. I grew up on a farm in Missouri, though I haven't ridden regularly since I was a girl. Hank looked surprised. What brought you out west then? Josephine's expression clouded. Necessity. Before Hank could inquire further, the sound of a twig snapping in the nearby trees caught their attention. In an instant, Hank had drawn his revolver and placed himself between Josephine and the potential threat. A moment later, a young buck emerged from the trees, regarding them with wary eyes before bounding away across the meadow. Josephine released the breath she had been holding, but Hank remained tense, his eyes scanning the tree line. "We should keep moving," he said, his voice low. "I don't like being in the open for too long." They mounted up and continued their journey, but the carefree atmosphere of earlier had vanished. Hank was more vigilant now, frequently checking their back trail and keeping his hand near his weapon. "Do you think we're being followed?" Josephine finally asked. "I'm not sure," Hank replied honestly, "but I've learned to trust my instincts, and right now they're telling me to be careful." They pushed on through the afternoon, the trail becoming increasingly rugged as it wound through rocky outcroppings and dense stands of pine. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Hank suddenly raised his hand, signaling Josephine to stop. "What is it?" she whispered, her heart beginning to race. Hank pointed to a narrow path branching off from the main trail. "That's not supposed to be there. Someone's been through here recently." Before Josephine could respond, the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the hills, and a bullet splintered the bark of a tree just inches from her head. "Ride!" Hank shouted, wheeling his horse around. "Follow the trail!" Josephine didn't hesitate, urging her mare forward as more shots rang out behind them. She leaned low over the horse's neck, her hair streaming out behind her as they galloped down the trail. She could hear Hank's horse close behind, along with the distant sound of pursuit. The trail curved sharply around a massive boulder, momentarily hiding them from view of their attackers. Hank caught up to her, his expression grim. "There's a ravine ahead," he said breathlessly. "If we can reach it, we might be able to lose them." Josephine nodded, her throat too dry with fear to speak. They pressed on, the horses snorting with exertion as they navigated the increasingly treacherous path. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Hank showed no sign of slowing down. Finally, the trail opened onto a steep-sided ravine, a stream flowing along its bottom. Hank led the way down a barely visible path that zigzagged to the bottom, the horses sliding and scrambling on the loose stones. Once they reached the stream, Hank dismounted and helped Josephine down. "We'll lead the horses upstream," he said. "The water will hide our tracks." They waded through the cold water, leading the tired horses by their reins. The ravine walls rose steeply on either side, providing some cover from anyone who might be watching from above. After about half a mile, Hank spotted what he was looking for: a narrow side canyon that would be invisible to anyone not already inside the ravine. "In here," he whispered, guiding Josephine and the horses into the hidden canyon. The space was tight, with barely enough room for the two horses and their riders to stand abreast. The walls rose almost vertically on either side, and a trickle of water seeped down one face, nourishing a small patch of ferns and moss. "We'll wait here until dark," Hank decided. "If they follow us into the ravine, they'll likely continue upstream." Josephine leaned against the cool rock wall, her heart still pounding from their desperate flight. "How did they find us?" she asked. Hank's expression was troubled. "I don't know. They shouldn't have known about this trail. Could someone in Cedar Ridge have told them? The bartender, maybe?" "Possibly," Hank admitted. "Or they could have picked up our trail earlier than I expected. The Blackburn Gang has some skilled trackers." As the adrenaline of their escape began to fade, Josephine became aware of a stinging sensation on her cheek. She reached up, and her fingers came away with a smear of blood. "You're hurt," Hank said, moving closer to examine the wound. It must have been a splinter from the tree when that bullet hit, Josephine said, wincing as Hank gently brushed her hair away from her face. Hold still, he murmured, retrieving a canteen from his saddle. He dampened a clean handkerchief and carefully cleaned the small cut on her cheekbone. It's not deep. You were lucky. His face was very close to hers, his blue eyes focused intently on his task. Josephine found herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his left eyebrow, the way his sun-bleached hair fell across his forehead. There, he said softly, his fingers lingering on her skin. All better. Josephine was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of his hand against her cheek. For a moment they remained frozen, gazes locked, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Then Hank cleared his throat and stepped back, turning to secure the horses. We should try to rest while we can. It'll be a hard ride once it's dark. Josephine nodded, ignoring the strange flutter in her chest as she settled onto the ground, her back against the canyon wall. Despite the danger they were in, she found herself watching Hank as he moved about their small shelter, struck by the easy grace of his movements and the capable strength of his hands. It was ridiculous, she told herself firmly. She barely knew this man, and they were running for their lives. This was hardly the time to be noticing such things. And yet, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across their hidden canyon, Josephine couldn't deny the growing connection she felt to the quiet, honorable cowboy who had risked everything to help her. As dusk settled over the land, Hank prepared to move out. He checked his weapons, ensured the horses were well rested, and laid out their route in hushed tones. They would continue through the ravine until it opened onto a valley, then make their way east, through a series of lesser-known trails that would eventually lead them to Silverdale. It'll be slow going in the dark, he warned as he helped Josephine mount her horse. Stay close to me and follow my lead. The night was clear but moonless, the stars providing the only illumination as they made their cautious way along the ravine floor. The gurgle of the stream beside them and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds breaking the silence. Josephine's nerves were stretched taut, every shadow seeming to conceal a potential threat. After what felt like hours, the ravine began to widen, its walls growing less steep until finally they emerged into a broad valley. The terrain here was more open, with scattered stands of pine and patches of scrub oak breaking up the grassy expanse. We're making good time, Hank said, keeping his voice low. If we can reach the eastern ridge by dawn, we'll have a straight shot to Silverdale. They rode steadily through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and stretch their legs. Josephine was exhausted, the strain of constant vigilance wearing on her already taxed resources, but she refused to complain. Hank looked equally tired, though his alertness never wavered. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, they reached the ridge Hank had mentioned. From this vantage point, they could see for miles in every direction. The landscape was breathtaking rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. There, Hank said, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley perhaps 10 miles distant. That's Silverdale. Josephine felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Safety was within reach, but it also meant parting ways with Hank. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. We should be able to reach it by midday, Hank continued, unaware of her thoughts. The terrain is easier from here. As they prepared to continue their journey, a flash of movement in the valley below caught Josephine's attention. She squinted, trying to make out details in the dim light. Hank, she said urgently, down there, riders. Hank followed her gaze, his expression hardening as he spotted the group of horsemen making their way across the valley floor. Even from this distance, there was no mistaking their purpose or direction. They're cutting us off, he said grimly. They must have guessed our destination. What do we do? Josephine asked, fear clutching at her heart once more. Hank studied the terrain, his mind working quickly. "There's another way," he said finally. "It's longer and rougher, but it'll get us to Silverdale from the north, where they won't be expecting us." Without waiting for a response, he turned his horse away from the ridge and led the way into a dense stand of pine. The path here was barely visible, choked with underbrush and fallen logs that forced them to move at a slow pace. "This trail hasn't been used in years," Hank explained as they picked their way through the difficult terrain. "It was an old trapper's route before the railroad came through." The going was painfully slow, the horses struggling at times to find secure footing among the rocks and tangled roots. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on them with increasing intensity. Josephine's throat was parched, her water supply running low, but she pressed on, following Hank's lead without complaint. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a small plateau overlooking a different section of the valley. Silverdale was visible again, closer now but still several hours' ride away. "We'll rest here for a bit," Hank decided, dismounting and helping Josephine down. "The horses need water. And so do we." A small spring bubbled up from the rocks nearby, providing clear, cold water that they drank gratefully. Josephine splashed some on her face, washing away the dust and sweat of their journey. "You're holding up well," Hank observed, his tone admiring. "Most people would have broken down by now." Josephine managed a tired smile. "I'm tougher than I look." "So I'm learning," Hank replied, his gaze lingering on her face. There was something in his expression that made Josephine's heart beat a little faster. She looked away, suddenly self-conscious of her disheveled appearance after days on the trail. "Tell me about San Francisco," Hank said after a moment. "What will you do there?" Grateful for the change of subject, Josephine said, "My aunt runs a millinery shop. I'll help her with the business. I've always had a knack for design." "A hat maker," Hank mused, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I can see that. You have an eye for detail." "What about you?" Josephine asked. "What will you do after this is over?" Hank's smile faded. "Keep moving, I suppose. It's what I've been doing for years now." "That sounds exhausting," Josephine said softly. "Always looking over your shoulder, never putting down roots." "It is," Hank admitted. "But I don't see another way. Not as long as Blackburn is out there." Josephine was silent for a moment, considering. "What if you went to the law? Told them what you know about the gang? Helped them bring Blackburn to justice?" Hank shook his head. "I'd likely end up swinging from the same rope as the rest of them. I may have left the gang, but I still rode with them for a time. The law doesn't look kindly on that." Before Josephine could respond, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley, followed by the impact of a bullet striking rock just feet from where they stood. "Get down!" Hank shouted, grabbing Josephine and pulling her behind a large boulder as more shots rang out. Josephine's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed herself against the cool stone. Hank drew his revolver, his expression grim. "They've found us," he said unnecessarily. "They must have spotted us from below." Josephine peered around the edge of the boulder, trying to locate their attackers. She could make out several figures on horseback at the base of the plateau, their rifles trained on the rocks where she and Hank had taken cover. "We're trapped up here," she realized with growing horror. Hank's expression was determined. "Not yet. We're not." He glanced around, assessing their situation. "There's a path down the backside of this plateau. It's steep, but if we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to circle around them." More bullets struck the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying. Hank returned fire, forcing their attackers to seek cover temporarily. "When I start shooting again, run for those trees," he instructed, indicating a stand of pine about 50 yards to their right. "Stay low and don't stop until you reach them." Josephine nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. Hank counted down with his fingers, 3, 2, 1. then stood and fired several shots in quick succession. Josephine didn't hesitate, launching herself from behind the boulder and sprinting toward the trees, keeping her body as low as possible. Bullets kicked up dirt at her feet and whizzed past her head, but she didn't slow down. Her lungs burned and her legs ached, but fear gave her speed she didn't know she possessed. She reached the trees and dove behind a thick trunk, gasping for breath. A moment later, Hank joined her, having provided covering fire until she was safe. "Good," he panted. "Now for the horses." The animals were still near the spring, frightened by the gunfire but unable to flee due to their tethers. Getting to them would mean crossing another exposed stretch of ground. "I'll go," Hank decided. "You stay here." "No," Josephine protested. "It's too dangerous. They'll be watching for movement now." "We don't have a choice," Hank replied grimly. "Without the horses, we're as good as dead." Before she could argue further, he was gone, darting from tree to tree, using whatever cover was available. Josephine watched, her heart in her throat, as he made his way toward the spring. The gunfire had ceased, the attackers apparently regrouping or changing position. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the sound of bullets. Josephine scanned the base of the plateau, trying to spot their pursuers, but they had hidden themselves well. Hank reached the horses and quickly untethered them, leading them back toward the trees as fast as he dared. He had almost reached the relative safety of the tree line when a shot rang out, and Hank stumbled, clutching his side. "Hank!" Josephine cried out, forgetting caution in her fear for him. Despite his injury, Hank managed to reach the trees, leading both horses with him. His face was pale and blood seeped between the fingers pressed to his side. "How bad is it?" Josephine asked, reaching for him. "Just a graze," he said through gritted teeth, though the amount of blood suggested otherwise. "We need to move. They'll be coming up after us now." With Josephine's help, Hank mounted his horse, wincing at the movement. She quickly climbed onto her own mare, and they set off through the trees, following the path Hank had mentioned earlier. As he had warned, the trail was steep and treacherous, requiring all of Josephine's concentration to navigate safely. Behind them, they could hear shouts as their pursuers discovered their escape route. "They'll be right behind us," Hank said, his voice strained. "We need to find somewhere to make a stand." Josephine glanced at him with alarm, noting the growing bloodstain on his shirt and the sheen of sweat on his forehead. "You're in no condition to fight." "Don't have much choice," he replied grimly. They descended the trail as quickly as they dared, the horses picking their way carefully among the loose rocks and exposed roots. The shouts behind them grew fainter, suggesting they had gained some distance on their pursuers. At the base of the plateau, the trail opened onto a small canyon, its walls lined with caves and rock formations that might provide cover. Hank directed them toward one such cave, its entrance partially concealed by a stand of scrub oak. "In here," he said, dismounting with difficulty. "We can defend this position." Josephine helped him into the cave, alarmed at how heavily he leaned on her. Inside, the space was larger than it appeared from the outside, extending back into the rock face for about 20 feet. "Tie the horses at the back," Hank instructed, slumping against the wall near the entrance. "Then come help me with this." Josephine did as he asked, securing the tired animals where they would be out of the line of fire. When she returned to Hank, she was shocked at how pale he had become. "Let me see that wound," she insisted, kneeling beside him. Hank reluctantly moved his hand, revealing a bloody gash across his ribs. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It needs to be cleaned and bandaged," Josephine said firmly. She retrieved the canteen and the remains of Hank's handkerchief, along with a clean shirt from his saddlebag. As gently as possible, she cleaned the wound, relieved to find that while it was deep, the bullet had indeed only grazed him rather than penetrating. Hank remained silent throughout her ministrations, though she could feel him tense when she touched particularly tender areas. You've done this before, he observed as she tore the clean shirt into strips for bandages. My mother was a healer of sorts, Josephine explained, carefully wrapping the makeshift bandage around his torso. People in our community came to her when they were sick or hurt. I learned from watching her. Hank studied her face as she worked, his blue eyes intent. You're a remarkable woman, Josephine Nichols. Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. Hold still, she murmured, focusing on securing the bandage. There. That should help for now, but you'll need proper medical attention as soon as possible. Thank you, Hank said, his hand covering hers where it rested on the bandage. For a moment, they remained like that, their gazes locked in the dim light of the cave. The spell was broken by the sound of horses approaching. Hank immediately reached for his revolver, his expression hardening. They're coming, he said. Stay back, out of sight. I can shoot, Josephine reminded him, drawing her own weapon. You taught me, remember? Hank looked like he wanted to argue, but another wave of pain crossed his face, and he nodded reluctantly. Just be careful. Don't expose yourself unnecessarily. They positioned themselves on either side of the cave entrance, peering cautiously out at the canyon floor. 4 riders had entered the canyon and were moving slowly, scanning the rock face for signs of their quarry. Josephine recognized one of them as the man who had searched the barn where she had hidden that first night. Another was younger, barely more than a boy, with a shock of red hair visible beneath his hat. The third was a heavy-set man with a bushy beard. The fourth, riding slightly ahead of the others, had to be Theodore Blackburn himself, a tall, lean figure with cold eyes and a face that seemed carved from stone. That's him, Hank whispered, confirming her suspicion. Blackburn. What do we do? Josephine asked, her mouth dry with fear. Wait for them to get closer, Hank replied grimly. Make every shot count. The riders advanced cautiously, their weapons drawn as they examined each potential hiding place along the canyon walls. They were perhaps 50 yards away when Blackburn raised his hand, signaling his men to stop. Sutton, he called out, his voice echoing off the rock walls. I know you're here somewhere. Show yourself. Hank remained silent, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his revolver. You're only delaying the inevitable, Blackburn continued. Come out now, bring the girl, and maybe I'll let you die quick instead of slow. Still no response from Hank. Blackburn signaled to his men to spread out and continue searching. They were now close enough that Josephine could see the dust on their clothes and the sweat on their horses' flanks. When I give the word, Hank murmured, aim for the horses. It'll create confusion and give us an advantage. Josephine nodded, though the thought of shooting a horse turned her stomach. She understood the necessity unmounted. Their pursuers would be at a disadvantage in the open canyon. The riders drew closer, now just 30 yards from the cave entrance. Josephine's hand was sweating around the grip of her revolver, and she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Now, Hank said softly, and they both fired. Josephine's shot went wide, but Hank's struck true, hitting Blackburn's horse in the shoulder. The animal reared, throwing its rider before collapsing to the ground. The other men reacted instantly, returning fire as they sought cover among the rocks. Bullets ricocheted off the cave entrance, forcing Hank and Josephine to pull back. Hank winced as the movement aggravated his wound, but he continued firing, his aim steady despite his injury. They're pinned down for the moment, he said, pausing to reload, but they'll try to flank us soon. As if on cue, the youngest outlaw made a dash for a boulder closer to their position, firing wildly as he ran. Josephine took aim and pulled the trigger, surprised when her shot struck him in the leg. The young man fell with a cry, dragging himself behind the boulder as his companions provided covering fire. Good shot, Hank said, his expression grim but approving. The exchange of gunfire continued for several minutes, neither side able to gain a clear advantage. Hank's face grew increasingly pale, and Josephine noticed fresh blood seeping through his bandage. The exertion was reopening his wound. "We need to end this quickly," she said, worry evident in her voice. Hank nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll draw their fire. When they focus on me, make for the horses. Ride for Silverdale and don't look back." "What?" "No," Josephine protested. "I'm not leaving you here." "This isn't a debate, Josephine," Hank said firmly. "You're the witness. If you can reach the law in Silverdale, they can bring Blackburn to justice. That's what matters." "You matter too," Josephine insisted, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. Hank's expression softened. "I appreciate that. But this is the only way. I've been running from Blackburn for 3 years. It's time it ended, one way or another." Before she could argue further, a new sound caught their attention: hoofbeats, many of them, approaching from the direction of Silverdale. Both Hank and Josephine peered cautiously out of the cave. A group of 6 mounted men entered the canyon, led by a figure wearing a silver star on his chest. The sheriff of Silverdale, accompanied by his deputies. The outlaws, caught in the open between 2 sets of opponents, hesitated. Blackburn, now on foot, shouted something to his men that Josephine couldn't make out over the distance. "Throw down your weapons!" the sheriff called out. "You're surrounded." For a tense moment, it seemed like the Blackburn gang might choose to fight. Then, slowly, the heavy-set man lowered his rifle to the ground. The wounded young outlaw followed suit. Only Blackburn remained defiant, his hand hovering near his revolver. "Don't be a fool, Blackburn," the sheriff warned. "It's over." With a curse that carried clearly in the still air of the canyon, Blackburn finally dropped his weapon. The deputies moved in quickly, disarming and restraining all 3 men. Hank let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the lawman arrived. "Well," he said with a wry smile, "that's something you don't see every day." "How did they know to come here?" Josephine wondered, relief making her light-headed. "I'd wager Emma had something to do with it," Hank replied. "She has connections in Silverdale. I told her where we were headed just in case." They emerged cautiously from the cave, Hank leaning heavily on Josephine for support. The sheriff looked up at their approach, his weathered face registering surprise as he recognized Hank. "Sutton?" he called out. "That you?" "Hello, Sheriff Mills," Hank replied, his voice strained. "Good timing." The sheriff dismounted and approached them, eyeing Hank's bloody bandage with concern. "You look like hell, son." "Feel about the same," Hank admitted. Sheriff Mills turned his attention to Josephine. "And you must be the witness we've been hearing about. Got a telegram from Cedar Ridge saying a young woman had witnessed the Blackburn Gang murder, a stagecoach driver, and that Hank here was helping her." "Yes, sir," Josephine confirmed. "My name is Josephine Nichols." The sheriff nodded. "Well, Miss Nichols, your testimony will be greatly appreciated. We've been after Blackburn and his gang for years." One of the deputies approached, leading Blackburn in handcuffs, the outlaw's cold eyes fixed on Hank with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over, Sutton," he snarled, "not by a long shot." "Actually, I think it is," Sheriff Mills said, signaling his deputy to take Blackburn away. "He'll hang for what he's done, and his gang with him." He turned back to Hank and Josephine. "Let's get you both back to town. That wound needs tending, and I expect you could both use a decent meal and a proper bed." The ride to Silverdale was mercifully uneventful. Hank's wound was painful but not life-threatening, and the knowledge that Blackburn was in custody lifted a weight from both their shoulders. Josephine rode beside Hank, occasionally steadying him when he swayed in the saddle. Silverdale proved to be a thriving little town, with a main street lined with businesses and a surprisingly grand hotel for such a remote location. The sheriff escorted them directly to the doctor's office, where Hank's wound was properly cleaned and stitched. "You're lucky," the doctor informed him as he applied a fresh bandage. "Another inch to the right and we'd be having a very different conversation." Hank managed a tired smile. Story of my life, Doc. Once Hank was patched up, Sheriff Mills arranged rooms for them at the hotel, separate rooms, of course, with a deputy posted in the hallway, for Miss Nichols's protection, though Josephine suspected it was equally to ensure that Hank didn't leave town before giving his statement. The hotel room was a luxury beyond anything Josephine had expected: a soft bed with clean sheets, a washstand with hot water, and a window overlooking the town square. After days on the trail, the simple comforts seemed almost unreal. She washed and changed into a nightgown provided by the hotel proprietress, who had taken one look at Josephine's trail-worn appearance and insisted on lending her some clothing until the dressmaker can fix you up proper. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Josephine. Her mind kept replaying the events of the past few days: the stagecoach robbery, the desperate flight through the wilderness, the final confrontation in the canyon. And through it all, Hank's steady presence, his unwavering determination to see her safely to Silverdale. She found herself wondering what would happen now. Blackburn would stand trial, and with her testimony and Hank's, there was little doubt he would be convicted. But what then? Would Hank continue his nomadic existence, or might he consider staying in one place now that the threat of Blackburn was removed? And what of her own plans? San Francisco suddenly seemed very far away, and not just in terms of physical distance. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Cautiously, she approached, asking, "Who is it?" "It's me," Hank's voice replied. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Josephine opened the door to find Hank standing in the hallway, looking somewhat better after his visit to the doctor. He had bathed and changed into clean clothes, though his face still bore the strain of their ordeal. "You should be resting," she admonished gently. "I will," he promised. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Josephine stepped back, inviting him into the room. She was acutely aware of the impropriety of having a man in her hotel room at this hour, but after everything they had been through together, conventional social rules seemed trivial. "I'm fine," she assured him. "Just finding it hard to believe that it's really over." Hank nodded in understanding. "I know what you mean. I've been looking over my shoulder for so long, it's hard to imagine not having to anymore." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, neither quite sure what to say now that the immediate danger had passed, and they were no longer focused solely on survival. "Sheriff Mills says the trial will be held in Denver," Hank finally said. "We'll both need to testify." "Yes, he mentioned that to me as well," Josephine replied. "He thinks it will be in about 2 weeks." Another silence fell between them. Josephine found herself studying Hank's face, noting the tired lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. There was something he wasn't saying, some decision he had made that was weighing on him. "What will you do after the trial?" she asked, voicing the question that had been on her mind. Hank hesitated, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "For 3 years, all I've done is run and hide. I haven't allowed myself to consider a future beyond the next town, the next job." "And now?" Josephine prompted when he fell silent again. "Now I'm not sure," he said honestly. "What about you? Will you still go to San Francisco?" It was Josephine's turn to hesitate. The plan that had seemed so clear just days ago now felt like it belonged to a different person, a different life. "I don't know," she admitted. "My aunt is expecting me, but—" "But?" Hank encouraged, taking a step closer to her. Josephine found herself struggling to articulate the confusion of emotions she was feeling. "It's just, so much has changed in such a short time. I'm not the same person who boarded that stagecoach in Hollow Creek." Hank's expression softened. "No, I don't suppose you are." Their gazes held, and in that moment, Josephine felt the shift between them from fellow fugitives bound by circumstance to something deeper, something with the potential to be far more meaningful. Hank seemed to sense it too. He cleared his throat, taking a small step back as if to give her space. I should let you rest. It's been a long day. Yes, Josephine agreed, though she found herself reluctant to see him go. Good night, Hank. Good night, Josephine, he replied, his voice soft. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'm glad I was in Cedar Ridge that night, despite everything that happened after. Before she could respond, he was gone, closing the door quietly behind him. Josephine stood there for a long moment, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. Then, with a sigh, she returned to the bed, though she suspected sleep would be even more elusive now than before. The next morning, Josephine was awakened by a knock at her door. It was the hotel proprietress, Mrs. Fletcher, with a bundle of clothing. Good morning, dear, the older woman greeted her warmly. I've brought you some things to wear until you can visit the dressmaker. Nothing fancy, mind you, but clean and decent. That's very kind of you, Josephine said, accepting the clothing gratefully. I don't know how to thank you. Mrs. Fletcher waved away her thanks. No need for that. The whole town's talking about you and Mr. Sutton, how you escaped the Blackburn Gang and helped bring them to justice. It's the most excitement we've had in Silverdale in years. After Mrs. Fletcher left, Josephine dressed in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue calico dress that was a bit too large but serviceable enough. She arranged her hair as best she could without proper pins or combs, then made her way downstairs to the hotel dining room. Hank was already there, seated at a table by the window. He stood when he saw her, a smile lighting his face in a way that made her heart skip a beat. Good morning, he greeted her. You look rested. I am, thank you, Josephine replied, taking the seat he held for her. How are you feeling? Your wound is healing nicely, according to the doctor, Hank assured her. I've had worse. They ordered breakfast, and as they ate, Hank filled her in on the latest news. Blackburn and his men had been transported to the jail in Denver under heavy guard. The stagecoach company had been notified of the robbery and murder, and they had sent word to the mining company about the stolen payroll. Sheriff Mills had already taken their preliminary statements, but they would need to provide more detailed testimony at the trial. The sheriff also mentioned something interesting, Hank said, his expression thoughtful. Apparently, there's a reward for information leading to the capture of the Blackburn Gang, a substantial one. Really? Josephine was surprised. Who's offering it? The railroad mostly, Hank replied. Blackburn hit one of their payroll shipments last year. They've been after him ever since. So, you'll receive a reward? Josephine asked, pleased at the thought that Hank might have some financial security after years of living hand to mouth. Hank shook his head. We both will. The sheriff says we'll split it, since both our testimonies are crucial to the case. Josephine blinked in surprise. But I didn't do anything. You're the one who risked everything to help me. You stood your ground when most would have run, Hank pointed out. You kept your head in a gunfight. You patched me up when I was hit. I'd say you earned your share. Before Josephine could argue further, Sheriff Mills entered the dining room, his expression serious. Mr. Sutton, Miss Nichols, he greeted them, removing his hat. May I join you? At their assent, he pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. I've just received a telegraph from Denver. The trial has been moved up. They want you both there by the end of the week. So soon? Josephine asked, surprised. Why the rush? The circuit judge is in Denver now, but will be moving on to New Mexico territory soon, the sheriff explained. They want to try Blackburn while he's available, rather than waiting for his return. Hank nodded in understanding. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning, Sheriff Mills replied. There's a train at 8 o'clock. I'll be escorting you both personally. After the sheriff left, Josephine and Hank sat in contemplative silence for a moment. The accelerated timeline meant decisions would need to be made more quickly than either had anticipated. I should send a telegram to my aunt, Josephine said finally. Let her know I've been delayed but that I'm safe. Hank nodded, his expression unreadable. Of course. They spent the rest of the day making preparations for their journey to Denver. Josephine visited the dressmaker, who promised to have a suitable traveling outfit ready by morning. Hank conferred with the sheriff about security arrangements for the trip, still concerned that some of Blackburn's associates might attempt to prevent them from testifying. That evening, they met for dinner in the hotel dining room once again. Josephine was struck by how different Hank looked in his clean clothes, freshly shaved and with his hair neatly trimmed. He was a handsome man, she realized, not for the first time, but perhaps for the first time without the distractions of danger and flight. You seem deep in thought, Hank observed as they ate. Josephine smiled. Just thinking about how strange it feels to be sitting in a proper dining room, eating a meal that isn't jerky and hardtack. Hank chuckled. I know what you mean. Civilization takes some getting used to after days on the trail. They fell into easy conversation, sharing stories from their lives before their paths had crossed. Josephine told him about growing up on her family's farm in Missouri, about her father's death from influenza when she was 16, and her mother's passing 2 years later. After that, there was nothing keeping me in Missouri, she explained. The farm was sold to pay debts, and I went to live with my mother's sister in Hollow Creek. But that didn't work out as I'd hoped. Something in her tone made Hank look at her sharply. What happened in Hollow Creek, Josephine? You've never really explained why you were so eager to leave. Josephine hesitated, then decided that after everything they had been through together, Hank deserved the truth. My aunt married again after I came to live with her. A banker named Warren Griffin. He was not a kind man, especially when he drank. At first, he merely tolerated my presence, but as time went on, he became interested in me in ways that were not appropriate. Hank's expression darkened. Did he hurt you? He tried, Josephine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The night before I left, he came to my room. I managed to fight him off, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried again. So I packed what I could carry and left on the first stagecoach heading west. Hank reached across the table and took her hand in his. I'm sorry that happened to you. His touch was warm and reassuring, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Thank you, she said softly. But in a strange way, I'm almost grateful. If not for Griffin, I wouldn't have been on that stagecoach. I wouldn't have met you. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Josephine felt heat rush to her cheeks. But Hank didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers tightened slightly around hers. I feel the same way, he admitted, his blue eyes intense, though I wish the circumstances had been different. They remained like that for a long moment, connected by more than just their joined hands, until the arrival of dessert forced them to separate. The rest of the meal passed in a companionable silence, punctuated by occasional conversation about their impending journey to Denver. As they prepared to part for the night, standing in the hotel hallway between their respective rooms, Hank said, Josephine, I've been thinking about what happens after the trial. Oh? She replied, her heart beating a little faster at the serious note in his voice. The reward money, he continued. It would be enough for a fresh start. For both of us. What are you saying, Hank? Josephine asked, hardly daring to hope that he might be suggesting what she thought he was. Hank took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. I'm saying that perhaps neither of us needs to be alone anymore, if you felt the same way. He trailed off, uncertainty evident in his expression. Josephine had never seen him look so vulnerable, not even when he was bleeding from a bullet wound. I do, she said softly, taking a step closer to him. Feel the same way, that is. Relief and joy spread across Hank's face. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. I know it's sudden. We've only known each other a few days, but I feel like I've known you much longer. I understand, Josephine assured him, after what we've been through together. It's more than that, Hank insisted. It's you, Josephine. Your courage, your kindness, your strength. I've never met anyone like you. Josephine felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the sincerity in his voice. Nor I you, she whispered. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Hank leaned down, his intention clear. But at the last moment, Josephine turned her face away, suddenly overwhelmed by the intensity of her emotions. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I'm not sure I'm ready. Hank immediately stepped back, respecting her hesitation. No apology needed, he assured her. We have time, Josephine, all the time in the world, now that Blackburn is behind bars. Grateful for his understanding, Josephine bid him good night and retreated to her room, her emotions in turmoil. She wanted nothing more than to fall into Hank's arms, to explore the connection that had formed between them under the most extreme circumstances. But a part of her was afraid that what they felt for each other was merely a product of their shared danger, a bond that might not survive in the mundane reality of everyday life. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams a confused mix of gunfights and gentle hands, of danger and safety intertwined. The journey to Denver the next day passed uneventfully, the comfort of the train a stark contrast to their previous mode of travel. Sheriff Mills accompanied them, along with one of his deputies, ensuring their safety. Hank was respectful of Josephine's need for space, sitting beside her but not crowding her, his presence reassuring without being overwhelming. Denver proved to be a bustling metropolis compared to Silverdale, with paved streets, gas lamps, and buildings that stretched several stories into the sky. They were escorted to a respectable hotel near the courthouse, where separate rooms had been arranged for them once again. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, sworn statements, and preparations for the trial. Josephine found herself reliving the horror of the stagecoach robbery again and again as she detailed what she had witnessed. Hank's testimony was equally important, providing context and inside knowledge of Blackburn's operations from his time with the gang. Throughout it all, Hank was a steady presence at her side, offering quiet support when the memories became too intense. They spent their evenings together, exploring the city, or simply sitting in the hotel lobby, talking about everything and nothing. Slowly, the wall Josephine had erected between them began to crumble. She found herself drawn to his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, and the gentle way he treated her not as something fragile to be protected, but as an equal partner in whatever lay ahead. The trial itself was a grim affair, with Theodore Blackburn glaring at them from the defendant's dock as they gave their testimony. But with the weight of evidence against him, including Josephine's eyewitness account of the stagecoach driver's murder and Hank's detailed knowledge of the gang's operations, the outcome was never really in doubt. After 3 days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Theodore Blackburn was sentenced to hang, along with the 2 senior members of his gang. The younger outlaw, barely 20 years old, received a lengthy prison sentence instead, in recognition of his age and the possibility of rehabilitation. As they left the courthouse after the sentencing, Josephine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was truly over. Justice had been served, and she could move forward with her life without looking over her shoulder in fear. "How do you feel?" Hank asked as they walked back to their hotel, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street. "Relieved," Josephine admitted. "And sad, in a way. A man will die because of my testimony." "A man who murdered without remorse," Hank reminded her gently. "You didn't condemn him, Josephine. His own actions did that." She nodded, knowing he was right but still troubled by the finality of it all. They walked in silence for a few blocks, each lost in their own thoughts. The lawyers say the reward money will be available tomorrow, Hank said eventually. We can make plans after that. Plans, Josephine repeated, the word heavy with significance. Hank stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. Josephine, I meant what I said in Silverdale. I care for you deeply. These past days have only strengthened those feelings. But I understand if you need more time, or if you still plan to go to San Francisco. Josephine looked up at him, at this man who had risked everything to protect her, who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness from the moment they met. In his blue eyes she saw a future uncertain, perhaps, but filled with possibilities. I don't need more time, she said softly. I know what I feel, Hank. I care for you too. More than I thought possible in such a short time. Hope bloomed in his expression. Does that mean... It means I'm not going to San Francisco, Josephine clarified. At least, not alone. Not if you were serious about that fresh start. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Hank assured her, taking her hands in his. But where would you like that fresh start to be? San Francisco? Denver? Somewhere else entirely? Josephine considered for a moment. I think I'd like to go somewhere quiet, somewhere beautiful, where we could build something together. A home. I know just the place, Hank said, his voice warm with excitement. There's a valley not far from Silverdale, with a creek running through it and the mountains as a backdrop. Good grazing land, fertile soil. I noticed it when we were making our way to town. It sounds perfect, Josephine said, smiling at his enthusiasm. They resumed walking, hand in hand now, discussing their plans with growing excitement. They would return to Silverdale, use some of the reward money to purchase land in the valley Hank had described. They would build a house, raise horses perhaps, or cattle. Maybe even start a family someday. That evening, they dined in the hotel restaurant, celebrating the end of the trial and the beginning of their new life together. Josephine wore a new dress purchased with an advance on the reward money, a deep blue that matched Hank's eyes. To justice, Hank proposed, raising his glass of wine in a toast. And new beginnings, Josephine added, touching her glass to his. As they dined, Josephine found herself studying Hank's face, memorizing each detail: the small scar near his eyebrow, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his mouth curved when he smiled. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow in question. Just making sure this is real, she explained, a little embarrassed at being caught staring. Sometimes it feels like I might wake up and find myself back on that stagecoach, with none of this having happened. Hank reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. It's real, Josephine. I promise you that. After dinner, they walked through the hotel garden, the night air cool and fragrant with the scent of flowers. They found a secluded bench beneath an arbor of climbing roses, the blooms silvery in the moonlight. I received a telegram from Sheriff Mills today, Hank said as they sat down. The land I mentioned, in the valley, it's available. He spoke to the owner on our behalf. That's wonderful news, Josephine replied, squeezing his hand in excitement. Hank turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. Josephine, I know this might seem rushed, but after everything we've been through, I'm more certain of this than I've ever been of anything. He took a deep breath. I love you. I think I started falling in love with you that first night in Cedar Ridge, when you stood in the doorway of the saloon, soaking wet and scared but still holding your head high. Josephine felt tears well up in her eyes, touched by the depth of emotion in his voice. Oh, Hank, I love you too. I think I knew it for certain in that cave, when you were willing to sacrifice yourself to save me. Hank's face lit up with joy at her words. He released her hand, only to cup her face gently between his palms. May I kiss you, Josephine? I've wanted to since that night in the hallway. Yes, she whispered, her heart pounding with anticipation. But as Hank leaned in, a sudden wave of shyness overcame her, and she found herself ducking her head, her hands coming up to cover her face. Hank paused, a tender smile spreading across his features. Gently, he took hold of her wrists, drawing her hands away from her face. "Don't hide from me," he murmured, his blue eyes warm with affection. And then, finally, his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it brought fresh tears to her eyes. His hands released her wrists to cradle her face once more, his touch reverent as his mouth moved softly against hers. Josephine's hands found their way to his shoulders, then slid up to the nape of his neck, her fingers threading through his hair as the kiss deepened. Time seemed to stop, the world narrowing to just the two of them in this moment of connection. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Hank rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for a very long time," he confessed. "It was worth the wait," Josephine replied with a shy smile. They remained in the garden for some time, talking quietly, sharing occasional kisses, and making plans for their future together. When the night air grew too chill, they reluctantly returned to the hotel, parting at Josephine's door with a final, lingering kiss. The next morning brought the formalization of their plans. They received the reward money, a sum substantial enough to purchase land, build a home, and still have plenty left over for emergencies. They sent telegrams Josephine to her aunt in San Francisco, explaining her change of plans, and Hank to Sheriff Mills in Silverdale, confirming their interest in the Valley property. 2 days later, they boarded a train back to Silverdale, their future stretching before them like the rails leading west. Josephine sat beside Hank, her hand in his, watching the landscape roll by and marveling at the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Hank asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "How differently things might have turned out," she replied. "If I hadn't been on that particular stagecoach, if you hadn't been in Cedar Ridge that night, if the Blackburn Gang hadn't chosen that day to rob the stage," Hank added, understanding her train of thought. Josephine nodded. "So many coincidences, so many chances for our paths never to have crossed." "Or perhaps not coincidences at all?" Hank suggested, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on the back of her hand. "Perhaps we were always meant to find each other, one way or another." Josephine smiled at the thought. "I'd like to believe that." "So would I," Hank agreed, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. Their return to Silverdale was met with a warm welcome from the townspeople, many of whom had followed the trial through telegraph reports. Sheriff Mills greeted them personally at the station, informing them that the property in the valley had been held for them as promised. "It's good land," he assured them as he drove them out to see it the next day. "Water year-round from the creek, plenty of grazing for livestock, and fertile soil for crops if you're of a mind to farm." The valley exceeded Josephine's expectations. It was a natural bowl surrounded by rolling hills, with mountains visible in the distance. The creek meandered through the center, lined with cottonwood trees that would provide shade in the summer and shelter from winter winds. A small clearing near the water seemed the perfect spot for a house. "It's beautiful," she breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Do you think you could be happy here?" Hank asked, a note of uncertainty in his voice for perhaps the first time since she had known him. Josephine looked at him, at this man who had become the center of her world in such a short time, and knew with absolute certainty that she could be happy anywhere, as long as he was by her side. "Yes," she said simply. "I could be very happy here. With you." The relief and joy on his face were answer enough, but Hank pulled her into his arms anyway, sealing the moment with a kiss that promised a lifetime of such moments to come. They wasted no time in making the valley their own. The purchase of the land was completed within days, and Hank immediately began making arrangements for the construction of a house. Josephine, meanwhile, set about creating a home from their temporary accommodations, a sturdy tent near the building site, furnished with basics from the general store in Silverdale. As summer turned to fall, the framework of their house began to take shape, built by Hank with help from men from town who were eager to earn extra money. Josephine spent her days assisting where she could, planning the interior layout and preparing for the colder months ahead. Their evenings were spent by the campfire, talking about their plans, sharing stories from their pasts, and growing closer with each passing day. Often, they would simply sit in comfortable silence, Josephine leaning against Hank's chest as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. On one such evening, as the first chill of autumn crept into the air, Hank cleared his throat nervously, drawing Josephine's attention from the fire. "I've been thinking," he began, unusually hesitant, "about us, about this place we're building together." "Oh?" Josephine prompted when he fell silent. Hank reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that glinted in the firelight, a simple gold band. "I know we've talked about our future together, but I realized I never properly asked you the most important question." Josephine's breath caught in her throat as Hank shifted to kneel before her, the ring held between his fingers. "Josephine Nichols, I love you more than I ever thought possible. You've brought light and hope back into my life when I thought both were lost forever. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred Josephine's vision as she nodded, too overwhelmed to speak for a moment. Then, finding her voice, she said, "Yes, Hank. Yes, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he looked up at her, there were tears in his eyes as well. Josephine threw her arms around him, nearly knocking him over in her enthusiasm, and they both laughed through their tears as they held each other close. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Silverdale, with Sheriff Mills giving the bride away and Mrs. Fletcher from the hotel dabbing at her eyes throughout the ceremony. It was a simple wedding, but to Josephine, it was perfect. She was marrying the man she loved, surrounded by people who had become friends, with a future full of promise stretching before them. Winter found them in their newly completed house, a sturdy structure built to withstand the harsh Colorado weather. The interior was still sparse, with only the most essential furniture, but Josephine had made it home with carefully chosen touches: curtains at the windows, a patchwork quilt on their bed, her mother's silver locket hanging on a nail beside the mirror. They spent the cold months planning for spring what livestock they would purchase, which crops they might plant, improvements to make to the house once the weather allowed. Hank taught Josephine to play poker during the long winter evenings, while she read to him from books purchased on their occasional trips into town. And on nights when the wind howled around the eaves and snow piled high against the walls, they found warmth in each other's arms, their love a shelter more secure than any house of wood and stone. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the valley and new life in every corner. Hank purchased a small herd of cattle and several horses, including a gentle mare specifically chosen for Josephine. They planted a vegetable garden near the house and fruit trees that would take years to bear, but represented their commitment to this land and each other. As the seasons passed, their home and ranch grew and flourished. Word spread about the quality of Sutton horses, and buyers began coming from as far away as Denver to purchase their stock. Josephine discovered a talent for breeding and training the animals, working alongside Hank as a full partner in their enterprise. Their family grew as well. 2 years after their wedding, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Hank's mother. A son, James, followed 3 years later, and another daughter, Catherine, 2 years after that. Through it all, the joys and challenges of building a life together, raising children, running a successful ranch, their love remained the foundation upon which everything else rested. They never forgot the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together, nor did they take for granted the second chance they had both been given. On the 10th anniversary of the day they met, Hank surprised Josephine with a special gift, a locket to replace the one that had been her mother's, which had finally worn out beyond repair. Inside the new locket was a tiny photograph of their children on one side and a lock of Hank's hair on the other. "So you'll always have us close to your heart," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. Josephine touched the locket with trembling fingers, moved beyond words by his thoughtfulness. "As if you could ever be anywhere else," she finally managed to say. That evening, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and pink. Josephine leaned against Hank's shoulder, his arm around her waist, holding her close. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked, echoing a conversation they had had years ago on the train to Silverdale. "Sometimes," Hank admitted. "But then I look at you, at our children, at everything we've built together, and I can't imagine any other path." "Nor can I," Josephine agreed, turning to face him. Even after all these years, the sight of him still made her heart beat a little faster. The sun had weathered his face, and there was silver now at his temples, but his blue eyes were as kind and warm as ever. "I love you, Hank Sutton," she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "And I love you, Josephine Sutton," he replied, leaning down to place a gentle kiss on her lips. As the last light of day faded from the sky, they remained on the porch, bound together by a love that had begun in danger and desperation, but had grown into something enduring and beautiful. A love that had transformed two lost souls into a family and a piece of wild valley into a home.